The contract papers scattered across the mahogany conference table as my son-in-law, Matthew Robinson, announced to his law partners, "My mother-in-law is from a different generation. These older folks just don't understand how modern finance works." What Matthew didn't know was that the elderly woman he was dismissing had just spent the morning reviewing the acquisition documents for his failing law firm. In 72 hours, I would walk into that conference room as the new owner, and Matthew would discover his financially clueless mother-in-law was about to become his boss. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The humiliation began at exactly 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in the glass-walled conference room of Robinson & Associates, a mid-tier law firm struggling to maintain its reputation in downtown Phoenix. I had arrived early for what I believed was a simple family dinner planning meeting, but what I walked into was Matthew Robinson holding court with his senior partners, discussing the firm's mounting financial troubles with the kind of desperate bravado that comes from watching your professional world crumble around you. "The problem is cash flow," Matthew was explaining to Theodore Thomas and Benjamin Anderson, the two founding partners who had built this firm from nothing 30 years ago. His voice carried that particular blend of confidence and panic that I had learned to recognize over the 5 years since my daughter Claire had married him. "We need investors who understand the modern legal landscape, people who get how technology and aggressive marketing can revolutionize a traditional practice." I settled into the leather chair by the window, assuming my usual role as the quiet family observer. At 68, I had grown accustomed to being invisible in rooms full of ambitious young professionals. My simple navy dress from Nordstrom Rack and sensible shoes marked me as someone from an earlier generation, someone whose opinions about business matters could be safely ignored by people who measured success in billable hours and client acquisition metrics. That's when Matthew noticed me sitting there, and his expression shifted to the kind of forced smile he reserved for managing inconvenient family obligations. "Oh, Evelyn's here early," he announced to the room, as if my presence required some sort of explanation or apology. "My mother-in-law wanted to discuss Claire's birthday party plans, but I figured she could wait while we finish up this important business discussion." Theodore and Benjamin nodded politely, clearly uncomfortable with the family dynamics playing out in their professional space. These were serious men dealing with serious problems. The firm was hemorrhaging money, losing clients to larger competitors, and facing the very real possibility of bankruptcy within the next 6 months. The last thing they needed was domestic interruptions from someone's elderly mother-in-law. But Matthew wasn't finished with his performance. He turned toward me with the kind of patronizing expression that adults use when explaining complex concepts to people they assume can't understand them. "We're talking about some pretty sophisticated financial strategies here, Evelyn. Investment structures, equity partnerships, that sort of thing. It's probably not something that would interest you." The casual dismissal stung, but it was nothing compared to what came next. As I sat there quietly, Matthew launched into what could only be described as a lecture about generational differences in financial understanding, using me as his primary example of outdated thinking. "The challenge with older investors," he continued, apparently forgetting that I was sitting right there, "is that they're locked into these conservative mindsets from decades ago. They think putting money in a savings account is investing. They don't understand venture capital, private equity, or aggressive growth strategies. My mother-in-law here is a perfect example. She probably still balances her checkbook by hand and thinks the stock market is gambling." Theodore and Benjamin shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly recognizing that Matthew was crossing lines of basic respect and decency. But Matthew was just getting started, apparently energized by his own analysis of my supposed limitations. "It's not their fault, really," he said, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering an academic presentation. "Their generation grew up during economic uncertainty, so they're naturally risk-averse. They can't conceptualize the kind of bold financial moves that are necessary in today's competitive landscape. They see a business losing money and think, failure, when what they should see is opportunity for strategic repositioning. I felt my hands tighten around the handle of my purse, not from anger exactly, but from the sheer audacity of listening to someone explain my psychological limitations to a room full of people who barely knew me. Matthew had never asked about my financial background, my investment experience, or my understanding of business principles. He had simply assumed that my age and modest appearance meant I was incapable of sophisticated thinking about money and success. The truth is, Matthew continued, now fully committed to his role as an expert on generational psychology, people like Evelyn are actually dangerous to modern business ventures. They ask questions that come from a place of fear rather than strategic thinking. They want to know about safety and guarantees instead of understanding that real wealth creation requires calculated risks and aggressive positioning. That's when he delivered the line that would change everything between us forever. These older folks just don't understand how modern finance works. They're stuck in this Depression-era mentality where you hide money under the mattress instead of putting it to work in dynamic markets. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Theodore and Benjamin were staring at their papers, clearly mortified by Matthew's complete lack of professional and personal decorum. I could see them processing the implications of what they had just witnessed, not just the disrespect toward a family member, but the kind of arrogant, dismissive attitude that probably explained why the firm was losing clients and struggling to maintain relationships with referral sources. But I said nothing. I simply sat there with my hands folded in my lap, wearing the expression of patient tolerance that I had perfected over decades of being underestimated by people who measured intelligence by age, gender, and appearance, rather than actual capability or achievement. What Matthew didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman he was dismissing as financially naive had spent the morning in a different kind of conference room, reviewing acquisition documents and financial projections with some of the most sophisticated business attorneys in the state. The same woman he was using as an example of outdated thinking had been building and managing a diversified investment portfolio for over 40 years, accumulating wealth that exceeded the annual revenue of most mid-sized law firms. The irony was almost too perfect to be accidental. Here was Matthew Robinson, a man whose law firm was failing due to poor financial management and strategic miscalculations, explaining the limitations of conservative financial thinking to a woman whose conservative approach had generated returns that averaged 18% annually for the past 2 decades. As I sat there listening to his analysis of my supposed psychological barriers to understanding modern finance, I was mentally reviewing the due diligence report I had received that morning on Robinson & Associates. The firm's financial situation was even worse than Matthew realized. Client retainer accounts were being used to cover operating expenses, payroll was running 2 weeks behind, and the partners were personally guaranteeing office lease payments that were absorbing nearly 40% of their monthly revenue. But perhaps most telling was the analysis of Matthew's personal financial situation. Information that had become available through the comprehensive background investigation that always preceded my major business acquisitions. Matthew Robinson was not just professionally struggling. He was personally drowning in debt, leveraged to dangerous levels, and making increasingly desperate financial decisions that suggested someone who understood neither risk management nor long-term strategic planning. The meeting ended with Matthew promising to call Theodore and Benjamin within 48 hours with a detailed proposal for attracting new investment capital to save the firm. As we walked to the parking garage, he turned to me with the kind of forced cheerfulness that suggested he was proud of his professional performance. "Sorry you had to sit through all that business talk, Evelyn," he said, his tone carrying the implied assumption that I hadn't understood any of it anyway. "I know financial discussions can be pretty boring for people who aren't used to dealing with complex investment strategies." I smiled and nodded, playing the role he needed me to play, at least for a few more days. It was very educational, Matthew, I said quietly. I learned quite a lot about how you think about money and business, relationships. He missed the subtle edge in my voice entirely, too focused on his own problems to recognize that his dismissive attitude toward his mother-in-law might have consequences he hadn't considered. As I drove home through the desert landscape of Phoenix, I found myself thinking about the conversation I would be having the next morning with my acquisition team and the very different kind of education Matthew Robinson was about to receive about the dangers of underestimating people based on their appearance and age. The game was about to change, though Matthew didn't know it yet. Soon, very soon, he would discover that the elderly woman he had used as an example of financial ignorance was about to become the most important investor in his professional life. What Matthew Robinson didn't know, what my own daughter Claire didn't even fully understand, was that the woman he had just dismissed as financially outdated controlled a business empire worth $127 million. Not inherited wealth, not lottery winnings, not the result of a lucrative divorce settlement, but money I had earned, invested, and multiplied through 4 decades of strategic acquisitions, calculated risks, and the kind of patient capital deployment that his generation mistook for timidity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The portfolio began in 1983 when I was 28 years old, recently divorced and working as a paralegal at a small estate planning firm in Tucson. I had $847 in savings, a used Honda Civic with 127,000 miles, and a burning determination to never again depend on someone else for my financial security. While my ex-husband spent his weekends playing golf and complaining about his job, I spent mine reading financial publications, studying SEC filings, and learning everything I could about how businesses actually created value. My first investment was $200 in a small pharmaceutical company that was developing a revolutionary new treatment for arthritis. The stock price had collapsed after early trial setbacks, and most investors had written it off as another biotech failure. But I had done my research, reading through hundreds of pages of clinical data and regulatory filings, and I believed the science was sound. 18 months later, when the FDA approved their treatment, my $200 had become $3,400. I reinvested every penny, along with every spare dollar I could save from my paralegal salary. I bought shares in a struggling software company that was developing something called spreadsheet applications for personal computers. I invested in a small chain of coffee shops that was experimenting with premium beans and European-style brewing methods. I purchased stock in a discount retailer that was pioneering something called big box stores in suburban locations. Each investment required months of research, hundreds of hours spent analyzing financial statements, market trends, and competitive landscapes. I studied annual reports like other people read novels, cross-referencing footnotes and diving deep into the assumptions underlying every projection and forecast. I learned to read between the lines of management discussions, to identify the gaps between what companies said they were doing and what they were actually accomplishing. By 1990, my portfolio was worth $180,000. By 1995, it had grown to $1.2 million. The secret wasn't luck or insider information. It was the disciplined application of fundamental analysis combined with the emotional detachment that came from understanding that investing was a business, not a hobby or a form of entertainment. While other investors panicked during market downturns, I saw opportunities to acquire quality assets at discount prices. When the dot-com bubble burst in 2000, I used the chaos to purchase shares in solid technology companies that had been unfairly punished by the market's irrational exuberance and subsequent crash. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, I deployed cash reserves to buy real estate and financial services stocks at prices that wouldn't be seen again for decades. But the portfolio was only one component of a much larger wealth-building strategy. Starting in the late 1990s, I began using my accumulated capital to acquire small businesses, typically struggling companies with solid fundamentals but poor management or inadequate financing. I would purchase these firms, implement operational improvements, and either manage them for cash flow or resell them at substantial profits. The first acquisition was a small accounting practice in Scottsdale that was hemorrhaging clients due to outdated systems and poor customer service. I bought it for $85,000, invested another $40,000 in technology and training, and sold it 18 months later for $340,000. The second was a failing restaurant supply company that needed working capital and better inventory management. Purchase price, $230,000. Sale price after restructuring, $890,000. Over the years, I had owned and operated 17 different businesses across 6 industries. Some I kept for cash flow, others I improved and sold. A few failed despite my best efforts, but the overall returns more than compensated for the occasional losses. Each transaction taught me something new about operations, management, market dynamics, and the psychology of business ownership. The law firm acquisition strategy had evolved naturally from this experience. Legal practices were particularly attractive targets because they often combined strong cash flow with poor business management. Lawyers were typically excellent at practicing law but terrible at running businesses, creating opportunities for someone with operational expertise and adequate capital to generate substantial returns through strategic improvements. I had quietly acquired controlling interests in 4 law firms over the past 8 years. 2 were estate planning practices that had grown dramatically after I implemented systematic marketing and client retention programs. 1 was a personal injury firm that had tripled its case volume after I invested in technology and expanded their referral network. The 4th was a corporate law practice that had become one of the most profitable firms in Albuquerque after I helped them restructure their partnership agreements and optimize their billing procedures. Robinson & Associates would be the 5th, and potentially the most interesting, because it would be the first acquisition where I had a personal relationship with the target's management team. Matthew had no idea that his condescending mother-in-law had been quietly studying his firm for 6 months, analyzing their client base, reviewing their financial statements, and developing a comprehensive turnaround strategy that would transform them from a struggling practice into a highly profitable regional powerhouse. The due diligence process had been thorough and revealing. Robinson & Associates was indeed in serious financial trouble, but the underlying fundamentals were sound. They had strong relationships with quality clients, a solid reputation in the legal community, and a practice mix that should have been generating substantial profits. The problem was entirely management-related: poor cost controls, inadequate marketing, inefficient workflows, and a partnership structure that rewarded seniority rather than performance. Theodore Thomas and Benjamin Anderson were competent lawyers, but incompetent businessmen. They had built their firm using the same strategies that worked in the 1990s, apparently unaware that the legal industry had changed dramatically over the past 2 decades. They were competing against more aggressive firms that use technology, marketing, and operational efficiency to deliver better results at lower costs. Matthew's approach to solving these problems was exactly what I would have expected from someone who confused activity with achievement. He wanted to invest in flashy marketing campaigns and expensive technology solutions without addressing the fundamental operational issues that were destroying the firm's profitability. He was proposing to spend money they didn't have on strategies that wouldn't work, while ignoring the systematic changes that could actually turn the business around. The irony was that everything Matthew needed to know about fixing his firm could have been learned by asking his supposedly outdated mother-in-law for advice. I had solved identical problems at multiple law firms, developing proven methodologies for improving profitability, client satisfaction, and market positioning. But Matthew was so convinced of his own sophistication and my limitations that it never occurred to him that I might have relevant experience or useful insights. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing the final acquisition documents that my attorney had prepared. The structure was elegant in its simplicity. I would purchase the firm's outstanding debt from their current creditors, assume their lease obligations, and inject sufficient working capital to stabilize operations. In exchange, I would own 100% of Robinson & Associates, with the authority to restructure management, modify partnership agreements, and implement whatever operational changes I deemed necessary. Theodore and Benjamin would be offered partnership positions in the new structure, with compensation based on performance rather than seniority. Their decades of experience and client relationships made them valuable assets worth retaining, assuming they could adapt to more rigorous management standards and accountability measures. Matthew, however, would face a different situation entirely. His current compensation exceeded his contribution to firm revenues by approximately 40%, and his attitude toward colleagues, clients, and family members suggested someone who had never learned the basic principles of professional respect and collaborative leadership. He would be offered a junior associate position with the opportunity to earn his way back to partnership through demonstrated performance and behavioral improvement. The acquisition would close in exactly 72 hours, assuming the final I. Due diligence confirmed what my preliminary analysis had revealed. Matthew would arrive at work on Friday morning expecting to discuss his grandiose plans for saving the firm through aggressive marketing and risky financial strategies. Instead, he would discover that his elderly mother-in-law had become his boss, and that his future at Robinson & Associates would depend entirely on his ability to learn some long-overdue lessons about humility, respect, and the true nature of business leadership. As I prepared for bed that night, I found myself thinking about the conversation I had overheard that afternoon, and Matthew's confident assertion that older people didn't understand modern finance. Tomorrow, he would begin learning that the most dangerous thing about making assumptions based on age and appearance was that sometimes the people you underestimate turn out to be the ones who ultimately control your destiny. The condescending behavior hadn't started immediately. During the early months of Matthew's relationship with my daughter Claire, he had been charming, respectful, and seemingly genuinely interested in getting to know her family. He asked thoughtful questions about my work, complimented my cooking, and even sought my advice about navigating the challenges of law school. I had initially seen him as exactly the kind of ambitious, intelligent young man who would make Claire happy and provide the stability she deserved. The transformation began gradually, so subtly that I didn't recognize it as a pattern until it had become deeply entrenched in our family dynamics. It started with small corrections and gentle explanations that seemed helpful rather than condescending. When I mentioned reading an article about changes in estate planning law, Matthew would smile and explain that newspaper coverage of legal issues was often oversimplified and that the real implications were much more complex than journalists understood. When I asked questions about his law school experiences, he would patiently clarify the sophisticated concepts that someone outside the legal profession might find confusing. At first, I appreciated his willingness to share his knowledge and help me understand his professional world. Matthew seemed eager to educate rather than exclude, and his explanations suggested someone who took pride in his expertise without being arrogant about it. Claire was clearly proud of his accomplishments and grateful that he was making an effort to connect with her family, so I ignored the slight edge of superiority that occasionally crept into his tone. The shift became more pronounced after Matthew graduated law school and joined Robinson & Associates as a junior associate. Success, even modest success, seemed to amplify his natural tendency toward intellectual arrogance, and he began treating our family conversations as opportunities to demonstrate his growing sophistication rather than genuine exchanges of ideas and information. During a dinner at Claire's apartment, I mentioned that I had been reading about changes in tax policy that might affect retirement planning. Matthew's response was to launch into a 20-minute lecture about the complexity of tax law, explaining that what I had read was probably dumbed down for general consumption, and that the real implications required the kind of advanced understanding that only came from professional training. He concluded by suggesting that I should probably consult with a qualified financial advisor rather than trying to interpret tax legislation myself. The irony was breathtaking. Here was a junior associate with less than 6 months of professional experience explaining tax policy to someone who had been successfully navigating complex tax optimization strategies for over 2 decades. But I said nothing, partly because I didn't want to create tension in Claire's relationship, and partly because I was curious to see how far Matthew's presumption would extend. The answer came quickly. At Claire's birthday party, Matthew appointed himself as the family's unofficial financial advisor, offering unsolicited guidance about everything from car purchases to retirement planning. When my nephew mentioned that he was considering buying a house, Matthew spent 45 minutes explaining the complexities of mortgage financing, real estate markets, and the tax implications of home ownership, apparently assuming that a 26-year-old with an engineering degree needed basic education about these concepts. When Claire's younger sister mentioned that she was thinking about starting a small business, Matthew delivered an impromptu seminar about the challenges of entrepreneurship, the importance of market research, and the legal structures necessary for protecting personal assets from business liabilities. His tone suggested that he was generously sharing sophisticated knowledge with people who lacked the background to understand these concepts without professional guidance. But it was his treatment of me that became increasingly problematic. Matthew seemed to have decided that my age and modest lifestyle made me a perfect example of outdated thinking about money and success, and he began using our interactions as opportunities to demonstrate his superior understanding of modern financial realities. When I mentioned that I had been following the performance of a particular mutual fund, Matthew explained that passive investing was a strategy best suited for people who lacked the sophistication to evaluate individual securities or alternative investment opportunities. When I asked about his thoughts on a recent merger in the banking industry, he suggested that such complex business transactions were probably too advanced for someone without professional training in corporate finance. The most galling incidents occurred during family gatherings where Matthew would hold court about investment strategies, business trends, or economic policy, always with the implicit assumption that he was educating people who couldn't possibly understand these concepts without his guidance. He developed a habit of prefacing his explanations with phrases like, "This might be hard to follow," or "I know this sounds complicated," that made it clear he viewed his audience as intellectually inferior. During one particularly memorable Thanksgiving dinner, Matthew spent nearly an hour explaining why older Americans were particularly vulnerable to financial scams and poor investment decisions. According to his analysis, people over 60 had grown up during different economic conditions and therefore lacked the cognitive flexibility necessary to understand modern financial markets. They were naturally conservative, risk-averse, and easily confused by complex investment products, making them easy targets for unscrupulous advisors and get-rich-quick schemes. The problem, Matthew explained while cutting his turkey with the precise movements of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, is that these folks think they understand money because they've been managing household budgets for decades. But personal finance and serious investing are completely different skill sets. You need to understand market dynamics, risk assessment, portfolio theory, tax optimization, concepts that most people have never been exposed to. He gestured toward me with his fork, apparently having forgotten that I was sitting right there. Take Evelyn, for example. She's obviously intelligent and capable, but her generation learned to think about money in terms of safety and preservation rather than growth and opportunity. They put money in savings accounts and think they're investing. They buy government bonds and feel sophisticated. They have no concept of equity markets, alternative investments, or aggressive wealth-building strategies. The casual cruelty of using me as a negative example while I sat at the same table was stunning. But what made it worse was the way Claire and the rest of the family nodded along, as if Matthew's analysis was both insightful and compassionate. He had positioned his condescension as concern, his arrogance as expertise, and his disrespect as honest assessment of generational limitations. After dinner, Matthew cornered me in the kitchen while I was helping Claire with the dishes. "I hope you didn't take offense at what I said earlier, Evelyn," he said with the kind of forced sincerity that made it clear he wasn't actually concerned about my feelings. "I know money talk can be intimidating for people who haven't had exposure to sophisticated financial concepts. If you ever want some guidance about retirement planning or investment strategies, I'd be happy to help you understand your options." This offer to educate me about investment strategies came from someone whose own financial situation was precarious enough that he was borrowing money from Claire to make his student loan payments. But Matthew's confidence in his superior knowledge was so complete that he apparently saw no contradiction between his personal financial struggles and his role as the family's investment advisor. The pattern extended beyond financial topics. Matthew had opinions about everything from healthcare policy to technology trends, and he expressed these opinions with the absolute certainty of someone who had never encountered a complex problem that couldn't be solved through the application of superior intelligence and professional training. He seemed genuinely convinced that his law degree and six-figure student debt had provided him with universal expertise that qualified him to educate everyone around him about virtually any subject. But perhaps most revealing was his treatment of service workers, older adults, and anyone else he perceived as occupying a lower position in the social hierarchy. Matthew's condescension wasn't limited to family members. It was a comprehensive worldview that divided people into categories of sophistication and ignorance, with himself firmly positioned among the sophisticated elite who understood how the world really worked. I watched him explain basic wine selection to a sommelier who had been working in restaurants for 20 years. I observed him lecturing a 60-year-old bank manager about changes in federal banking regulations. I witnessed him correcting a retired economics professor's analysis of inflation trends, apparently unaware that the man had spent 4 decades studying monetary policy. Each incident reinforced my growing understanding that Matthew's arrogance wasn't just a personality flaw, it was a fundamental inability to recognize expertise and intelligence in forms that didn't match his narrow definition of professional credentials and social status. He had learned to equate youth with innovation, formal education with intelligence, and professional titles with competence, never considering that real wisdom might come from experience, systematic thinking, or the kind of practical knowledge that couldn't be acquired in classroom settings. By the time Matthew delivered his performance at Robinson & Associates, explaining my supposed financial limitations to his law partners, I had endured 5 years of similar lectures and condescending explanations. The only difference was that this time, his arrogant assumptions were about to collide with reality in a way that would force him to confront the dangerous consequences of underestimating people based on age, appearance, and social position. The reckoning was coming, though Matthew still had no idea that his dismissive attitude toward his elderly mother-in-law was about to become the most expensive mistake of his professional career. Maintaining the facade of financial modesty while secretly controlling a $127 million business empire required a level of strategic deception that most people couldn't imagine, let alone execute successfully for decades. Every aspect of my daily life had to be carefully calibrated to support the narrative that I was exactly what I appeared to be: a retired paralegal living comfortably but modestly on a government pension and conservative savings. The performance began each morning with deliberate choices about clothing, transportation, and activities that would reinforce my carefully constructed image. My wardrobe consisted entirely of items purchased at mid-range department stores or discount retailers. Nothing too expensive, nothing too cheap, just the kind of practical clothing that someone on a fixed income might reasonably afford. I shopped at Kohl's and JCPenney, always during sales, always with coupons, always maintaining the behavior patterns of someone who needed to be careful about discretionary spending. My 2018 Honda Civic was purchased used with 23,000 miles, financed, through a conventional auto loan, despite having sufficient cash to buy 50 identical vehicles without affecting my monthly budget. The financing served two purposes. It created the paper trail of someone who needed to borrow money for major purchases, and it provided opportunities for Matthew to offer unsolicited advice about interest rates, loan terms, and the importance of maintaining good credit scores. The house I had owned for 15 years was a modest 3-bedroom ranch in a middle-class neighborhood where property values had remained stable but unspectacular. The original purchase price of $127,000 was well documented in public records, and the neighborhood was filled with retirees, government employees, and middle management professionals who represented exactly the socioeconomic demographic that Matthew expected me to belong to. But maintaining the physical facade was only the beginning. The real challenge was managing the complex financial infrastructure that kept my business activities completely separate from my apparent lifestyle. This required multiple legal entities, carefully structured trusts, and a network of professional relationships that could operate independently of my public persona as Evelyn Davis, retired paralegal. The investment portfolio was managed through Harbor Capital Management, a boutique wealth management firm in Denver that specialized in serving ultra-high net worth clients who valued discretion above all else. My primary contact, Victoria Hamilton, had been managing substantial portions of my portfolio for over a decade, but she knew me only as Edie Morgan, the principal of Morgan Family Holdings, a private investment company based in Delaware. Business acquisitions were structured through Phoenix Strategic Ventures, a holding company that owned interests in 17 different businesses across 6 states. The company's registered address was a prestigious office building in Scottsdale, but I had never personally visited the location. All communications were handled through my attorney, Oliver Williams, who served as the public face of Phoenix Strategic, while I remained completely anonymous as the beneficial owner. This elaborate structure meant that Matthew could research my background extensively without discovering any connection between his modest mother-in-law and the sophisticated business empire that was about to acquire his failing law firm. Public records showed Evelyn Davis as a former government employee with a modest mortgage, reasonable credit history, and the kind of unremarkable financial profile that matched perfectly with Matthew's assumptions about my capabilities and resources. The daily maintenance of these dual identities required constant attention to detail and careful management of potential exposure points. I maintained separate cell phones, email addresses, and mailing addresses for business activities. Important documents were delivered to a private mailbox service, and sensitive meetings were conducted in professional settings, where no one would recognize me as the grandmother from Phoenix who occasionally attended family gatherings. The most challenging aspect was managing personal relationships while maintaining operational security. Claire knew that I was comfortable in retirement, but had no idea about the true scope of my business activities. She assumed that my modest lifestyle reflected my actual financial circumstances, and I encouraged this assumption by occasionally mentioning concerns about inflation, healthcare costs, and other expenses that someone on a fixed income might reasonably worry about. When Claire needed help with unexpected expenses, car repairs, medical bills, or temporary gaps between jobs, I would provide assistance through carefully constructed explanations that made the help seem significant from my perspective while remaining trivial from my actual financial position. A $3,000 contribution toward her car repair would be presented as a substantial sacrifice that required careful budgeting, when in reality, it represented approximately 12 minutes of investment income. These deceptions felt increasingly uncomfortable as my relationship with Claire deepened and her marriage to Matthew became more serious. I was essentially lying to my own daughter about fundamental aspects of my life, creating a barrier between us that prevented genuine intimacy and honest communication. But I had convinced myself that the alternative, revealing my wealth and dealing with the complications that would inevitably follow, would be even more damaging to our relationship and her marriage. The business meetings required the most elaborate logistics and careful scheduling. Victoria Hamilton and I would meet monthly to review portfolio performance and discuss major investment decisions, but these meetings always occurred in Denver, usually scheduled around fictional visits to an imaginary friend who supposedly lived in Colorado. Oliver Williams and I communicated primarily through encrypted email and secure phone calls, with face-to-face meetings reserved for situations that required physical document signing or complex legal discussions. The law firm acquisitions presented particular challenges because they required extensive due diligence, site visits, and negotiations with target management teams. I had developed relationships with several intermediaries, business brokers, investment bankers, and legal consultants who could represent my interests without revealing my identity. These professionals understood that their client valued anonymity above all else, and they had been carefully selected based on their track record of maintaining confidentiality in sensitive transactions. For the Robinson & Associates acquisition, I had engaged Addison Myers, a corporate attorney based in Albuquerque, who specialized in representing anonymous buyers in professional services acquisitions. Addison knew me only as the representative of a private investment group that focused on underperforming legal practices in southwestern markets. She had no idea that her client was actually the mother-in-law of one of the target firm's associates. The due diligence process had been conducted entirely through intermediaries and public records research. Financial statements were obtained through normal business channels, client lists were analyzed through publicly available court filings, and operational assessments were based on observations conducted by management consultants who believed they were working for an out-of-state investment fund. Even the financing for the acquisition was structured to maintain complete anonymity. The purchase price would be funded through a combination of debt financing and equity contributions from Morgan Family Holdings, with all documentation showing Phoenix Strategic Ventures as the acquiring entity. Matthew and his partners would never see any paperwork connecting the transaction to Evelyn Davis or anyone else they might recognize. The personal cost of maintaining this elaborate deception was higher than I had anticipated when I first began, concealing my business activities. Living a double life meant constant vigilance about maintaining consistency between my apparent circumstances and my actual resources. It meant forgoing opportunities to share my professional successes with family members who might have been proud of my accomplishments. It meant listening to financial advice from people whose expertise was a fraction of my own, while pretending to find their guidance helpful and insightful. Most painfully, it meant watching Matthew's condescending treatment of me while knowing that his arrogance was based on fundamental misunderstandings about my capabilities and experience. Every lecture about investment strategies, every explanation of basic financial concepts, every dismissive comment about my supposed limitations was a reminder of how completely I had succeeded in creating a false identity that protected my privacy, while enabling others to underestimate and disrespect me. But the performance had also provided unexpected benefits. Living modestly while possessing substantial wealth had taught me to distinguish between genuine happiness and the kind of status-driven consumption that trapped so many wealthy people in cycles of competitive spending and social anxiety. I had learned to find satisfaction in simple pleasures, meaningful relationships, and the quiet confidence that came from knowing I could handle any financial challenge without depending on others for support or validation. The daily deception had also provided valuable insights into how people really thought about money, success, and social hierarchy when they believed they were interacting with someone who possessed limited resources. Matthew's treatment of me revealed aspects of his character that would have remained hidden if he had known about my wealth. His casual cruelty toward someone he perceived as financially inferior demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and moral limitations that would make him unsuitable for senior leadership positions in any organization I controlled. As I prepared for the final phase of the Robinson & Associates acquisition, I reflected on the irony that my most successful deception was about to become the foundation for the most honest conversation I had ever had with my family. In exactly 48 hours, The elaborate performance that had protected my privacy for decades would finally serve its ultimate purpose. Teaching Matthew Robinson that the most dangerous assumptions are often the ones that seem most obviously true. The decision to reveal my true identity came not through careful planning, but through a moment of clarity that arrived at 2:17 a.m. on Wednesday morning, as I sat in my home office reviewing the final acquisition documents for Robinson and Associates. I had been staring at Matthew's employment contract for nearly an hour, wrestling with the implications of what I was about to do, when I realized that my elaborate deception had become more damaging than the truth it was designed to protect. For decades, I had convinced myself that hiding my wealth was protecting my family from the complications and pressures that came with substantial money. I had imagined that revealing my success would create dependency, entitlement, or resentment that would poison our relationships and change how people saw me. But sitting there in the quiet darkness of my study, surrounded by documents that would make me Matthew's boss within 48 hours, I finally understood that my secrecy had enabled something far worse than anything I had been trying to prevent. Matthew's cruelty toward me wasn't just personal rudeness or generational misunderstanding. It was a systematic pattern of disrespect toward anyone he perceived as occupying a lower position in his personal hierarchy of success and sophistication. His condescending treatment of service workers, older adults, and family members he deemed financially naive revealed a fundamental character flaw that would poison any organization he was allowed to lead. The problem wasn't just that Matthew was arrogant. Plenty of successful people struggled with ego management without becoming actively destructive. The problem was that his arrogance was based on false assumptions about intelligence, capability, and the nature of success itself. He had learned to equate formal credentials with competence, youth with innovation, and professional titles with wisdom, never developing the intellectual humility necessary to recognize expertise in unexpected forms. By hiding my capabilities, I had inadvertently created a situation where Matthew could maintain these dangerous delusions without facing consequences. He could dismiss my opinions, ignore my insights, and treat me with casual disrespect, because nothing in his experience suggested that such behavior might be costly or inappropriate. I had become his enabler, providing him with a consequence-free environment where his worst instincts could flourish without correction. But the decision point wasn't just about Matthew's behavior. It was about my own integrity and the example I was setting for Claire and the rest of my family. By pretending to be someone I wasn't, I was essentially teaching them that success should be hidden, that capability should be downplayed, and that the opinions of arrogant people mattered more than honest self-expression. I was modeling exactly the kind of self-diminishing behavior that I would never want Claire to adopt in her own life and career. The final catalyst came when I realized that purchasing Robinson and Associates while maintaining my false identity would represent the ultimate corruption of everything I had worked to build. My business empire had been created through honest analysis, calculated risks, and the systematic application of intelligence and effort over decades. But acquiring Matthew's firm while he remained ignorant of my identity would be nothing more than an elaborate practical joke, a petty revenge scheme that diminished the legitimate business value of the transaction. If I was going to purchase Robinson and Associates, it needed to be as myself, Evelyn Davis, successful businesswoman and experienced investor, not as some anonymous entity hiding behind corporate veils and intermediary representatives. Matthew and his partners deserved to know who was buying their firm, and I deserved the satisfaction of being recognized for what I had actually accomplished rather than what I had pretended to be. The revelation strategy crystallized around a simple principle. Matthew needed to understand exactly who he had been dismissing and why his assumptions had been so completely wrong. This wasn't about humiliating him or destroying his career. It was about providing him with information that might force him to reconsider his fundamental assumptions about intelligence, success, and the dangerous consequences of treating people with disrespect. I called Addison Myers at 7:30 a.m. to inform her of the change in approach. Instead of proceeding with the anonymous acquisition through Phoenix Strategic Ventures, I would be purchasing Robinson and Associates directly as Evelyn Davis with full disclosure of my identity and business background. The transaction structure would remain the same, but the closing meeting would include a comprehensive presentation of my qualifications, experience, and plans for the firm's future. Addison was initially concerned about the loss of anonymity, pointing out that direct acquisition would eliminate the privacy protections I had worked so hard to maintain. But when I explained that the target firm included a family member who needed to understand the true nature of our relationship, she recognized that this was a personal decision that transcended normal business considerations. The next call was to Victoria Hamilton in Denver, informing her that I would be liquidating approximately $15 million in readily available assets to fund the Robinson and Associates acquisition without external financing. This would provide complete control over the transaction timeline and eliminate any dependencies on bank approvals or third-party due diligence that might delay the closing process. Victoria had managed enough unconventional requests over the years to understand that her clients occasionally made decisions based on personal rather than purely financial considerations. She simply confirmed that the asset liquidation could be completed within 48 hours and that the funds would be available for wire transfer by Friday morning. The most difficult call was to Oliver Williams, the attorney who had served as my primary legal representative for business matters throughout the development of my empire. Oliver had worked tirelessly to create and maintain the legal structures that protected my anonymity while enabling complex business transactions. Informing him that I was voluntarily abandoning these protections for personal reasons felt like dismissing decades of careful legal planning. But Oliver understood the situation better than I had expected. The legal structures were always tools to serve your objectives, he reminded me. If your objectives have changed, then the structures should change as well. The question isn't whether revealing your identity is legally advisable. The question is whether it serves your current goals better than continued anonymity. His analysis helped clarify the fundamental choice I was facing. For decades, my primary goal had been wealth preservation and growth, which required privacy and protection from public scrutiny. But now, my primary goal was relationship preservation and personal integrity, which required honesty and authentic self-expression. The legal structures that had served the first objective would only interfere with the second. The final element of the decision involved Claire and how much she should know about the situation before it played out publicly. I had been tempted to warn her that her husband was about to experience a significant professional shock, but I recognized that advance warning would put her in an impossible position between loyalty to her spouse and loyalty to her mother. Instead, I decided to let events unfold naturally, with the understanding that Claire would learn about my business activities at the same time as Matthew, but in a context where she could see both his behavior and my response. This would allow her to form her own judgments about the situation rather than forcing her to choose sides based on incomplete information. By Thursday evening, all the pieces were in place for what would be the most consequential business meeting of my career and the most honest conversation I had ever had with my family. The acquisition documents were finalized, the funding was arranged, and the closing was scheduled for 10 a.m. Friday morning in the conference room where Matthew had delivered his lecture about my supposed financial limitations just 3 days earlier. I spent Thursday night reviewing my notes and preparing for the presentation I would deliver to Theodore Thomas, Benjamin Anderson, and Matthew Robinson, when they learned that their firm had been purchased by the elderly woman they had dismissed as financially naive. The irony wasn't lost on me that the most important business presentation of my career would be delivered to an audience that included someone who had spent years explaining basic financial concepts to me as if I were incapable of understanding sophisticated investment strategies. But this presentation wouldn't be about revenge or humiliation. It would be about education. Matthew was about to learn that intelligence comes in many forms, that success can be achieved through many different paths, and that the most dangerous mistakes are often made by people who are absolutely certain they understand situations that they have never actually analyzed carefully. The game was finally about to change, and this time, everyone would know exactly who was making the rules. The first glimpse of the truth came through what appeared to be a simple accident, though it was actually the most carefully orchestrated moment of my entire deception. Thursday. Afternoon, I called Matthew's office and asked if we could meet for lunch to discuss Claire's upcoming birthday celebration. My tone was apologetic, suggesting that I knew I was interrupting important business matters with trivial family concerns. "Of course, Evelyn," Matthew replied with the patient tolerance he reserved for managing inconvenient family obligations. "Though I should mention that things are pretty hectic around here. We're dealing with some significant business challenges that require most of my attention. Maybe we could keep it brief?" We agreed to meet at Desert Bloom Cafe, a modest restaurant, in a strip mall that served the kind of simple, inexpensive food that someone on a fixed income might choose for a family lunch. I arrived early and selected a corner table where our conversation would be relatively private, but still visible to other diners, creating the perfect setting for what was about to unfold. Matthew arrived 15 minutes late, clearly distracted, and checking his phone repeatedly as he settled into the chair across from me. His appearance was more disheveled than usual, wrinkled shirt, tie slightly askew, the kind of scattered presentation that suggested someone under considerable stress trying to maintain a professional facade. "Sorry I'm late," he said, not looking particularly sorry. "Theodore and Benjamin called another emergency partners meeting this morning. The firm's financial situation is even worse than we initially thought. We're basically operating week to week now, hoping something changes before we have to start laying off staff." I nodded sympathetically while opening my purse to retrieve the folder of documents I had brought with me. The folder contained exactly what it appeared to contain: birthday party planning materials, restaurant menus, and invitation drafts. But it also contained something else that would fundamentally alter Matthew's understanding of his supposedly naive mother-in-law. "I brought some ideas for Claire's party," I said, spreading the legitimate documents across the table between us. "Though I have to admit, I'm not sure about the budget. Some of these venues are quite expensive, and I want to make sure we're being realistic about what we can afford." Matthew's expression brightened slightly, clearly pleased to be consulted about financial planning by someone who obviously needed guidance about managing money responsibly. This was exactly the kind of conversation where he could demonstrate his superior understanding of budgeting and cost management. "Let me take a look," he said, reaching for the restaurant menus with the confidence of someone accustomed to solving other people's financial problems. The key is to think about cost per person rather than total expenditure. You want to maximize value while staying within reasonable limits. As Matthew examined the party planning materials, offering predictable advice about venue selection and catering options, I carefully withdrew what appeared to be a routine bank statement from the folder. The document was genuine, a monthly summary from Pinnacle Private Banking, the wealth management division of a major national bank that served exclusively high-net-worth clients. The statement was formatted like any normal bank document, with account numbers, transaction summaries, and balance information. But this particular statement showed a money market account balance of $3.7 million, along with transaction details that revealed a sophisticated pattern of investment activity and asset management. I placed the statement face down on the table, next to my water glass, as if it were simply another piece of paperwork I needed to organize while we discussed party planning. The document was positioned so that Matthew could easily see it if he glanced in that direction, but not so prominently that it would seem like I was deliberately trying to show him something. "The challenge with birthday parties," Matthew was explaining while reviewing a catering menu, "is that people tend to overestimate how much food they actually need. You're better off ordering conservatively and having less waste than ordering too much and paying for food that gets thrown away." Nodded attentively while discreetly adjusting the bank statement so that the account balance became partially visible. The number $3,742,161 was now clearly readable to anyone sitting across from me, though the document's position made it appear as if I was unaware of what I had revealed. Matthew continued his analysis of the catering options for several more minutes before his eyes wandered to the papers scattered across our table. I watched his expression change as he processed what he was seeing, his confident explanation of cost management trailing off mid-sentence as he stared at the bank statement. "Evelyn," he said slowly, his voice carrying a note of confusion that hadn't been there moments earlier. "Is that your bank statement?" I glanced down at the document as if noticing it for the first time, then quickly moved to cover it with a napkin, my face showing the embarrassment of someone who had accidentally revealed private financial information. "Oh goodness, I'm so sorry," I said, my voice flustered in exactly the way someone might sound when caught with sensitive documents in a public place. I must have grabbed that by mistake when I was organizing the party materials. How embarrassing. But Matthew's analytical mind was already working to understand what he had seen. The account balance was far too large to be explained by government pension savings or conservative investment strategies. The bank name, Pinnacle Private Banking, was an institution that served exclusively wealthy clients with substantial assets and complex financial needs. "That balance," Matthew said carefully, as if he wasn't sure whether he should be asking the question. "It showed over $3 million. Is that really your account?" I looked around the restaurant nervously, as if concerned about who might overhear our conversation, then leaned forward slightly to lower my voice. "It's complicated, Matthew. That's just one account, and it's not something I usually discuss, especially not in public places like this." The phrase "just one account" hung in the air between us, carrying implications that Matthew was clearly struggling to process. If $3.7 million was just one account, then the total assets under management could be substantially larger. And if those assets were managed by Pinnacle Private Banking, then the sophisticated investment strategies and financial planning services suggested someone with far more wealth and financial sophistication than he had ever imagined. "But how?" Matthew asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, where did this money come from? You worked as a paralegal for most of your career, right? Even with good savings habits and conservative investing, I don't understand how you could accumulate this level of wealth." This was the moment I had been preparing for. The point where I would need to provide enough information to satisfy his curiosity without revealing the full scope of my business empire. The explanation needed to be plausible, but incomplete. Intriguing, but not overwhelming. "I made some investment decisions over the years that turned out better than I expected," I said carefully. "Nothing too sophisticated, just careful research and patience. When you have decades to let compound growth work, even modest investments can become substantial if you choose the right opportunities." Matthew stared at me as if he was seeing me for the first time, his entire understanding of my financial circumstances crumbling as he processed this new information. The elderly woman who had sat quietly while he explained basic investment concepts was apparently wealthy enough to require private banking services and sophisticated asset management. "What kind of investments?" he pressed, his lawyer's instincts driving him to gather more detailed information. "I mean, generating this level of returns would require exceptional performance or substantial initial capital. Most people don't accidentally become multimillionaires through conservative savings." I could see that Matthew was beginning to understand the implications of what he had discovered, but he was still processing the information within his existing framework of assumptions about my capabilities and background. He was looking for an explanation that would reconcile my apparent wealth with his belief that I lacked sophisticated financial knowledge. "Some technology companies, mostly," I replied, maintaining the tone of someone who was reluctant to discuss private financial matters but willing to provide basic information to family. "I started investing in personal computers and software companies back in the 1980s when most people thought they were just expensive toys. Companies like Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, I bought their stock when it was still relatively inexpensive and held on to it through all the market volatility. This explanation was technically accurate but deliberately incomplete. I had indeed made substantial investments in major technology companies, but those investments represented only a small fraction of my overall wealth-building strategy. The business acquisitions, real estate investments, and private equity positions that generated the majority of my returns remained completely hidden. But the timing, Matthew said, his analytical mind working to understand the mathematics of what I was describing. You would have needed to identify these opportunities before they became obvious to professional investors. That requires sophisticated market analysis and risk assessment capabilities. I shrugged as if the success had been more fortunate than strategic. I read everything I could find about the companies and their markets. Sometimes being willing to do extensive research gives you advantages that more sophisticated investors miss because they're looking for complex opportunities rather than obvious ones. Matthew sat back in his chair, clearly overwhelmed by the implications of what he had learned. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with him asking increasingly detailed questions about my investment philosophy, research methods, and long-term financial planning. I provided answers that were helpful but limited, maintaining the impression that my success had been achieved through diligent research rather than professional expertise. By the time we parted ways in the restaurant parking lot, Matthew's entire perception of my financial sophistication had been fundamentally altered. He no longer saw me as someone who needed education about basic investment concepts, but he wasn't yet ready to acknowledge that I might possess expertise that exceeded his own. The partial revelation had accomplished exactly what I intended. It forced Matthew to reconsider his assumptions about my capabilities, while creating curiosity about information that remained hidden. Tomorrow, during the acquisition meeting, he would learn that his wealthy mother-in-law was actually the sophisticated investor who was about to become his boss. But for now, he was still processing the initial shock of discovering that the woman he had been lecturing about financial strategies for years had been quietly accumulating wealth that exceeded his most optimistic career projections. The 24 hours following my lunch with Matthew created a fascinating case study in cognitive dissonance as he struggled to reconcile his fundamental assumptions about my capabilities with the inconvenient evidence of my actual financial success. The transformation in his behavior was immediate and obvious, but also incomplete and somewhat desperate, as if he was trying to maintain his sense of intellectual superiority while acknowledging facts that contradicted everything he thought. He knew about our relationship. The first sign of change came in a phone call that evening, just 3 hours after our lunch meeting. Matthew's voice carried a forced casualness that suggested he had been thinking about our conversation constantly since we parted ways. "Hey, Evelyn," he said, his tone attempting the kind of respectful interest that he typically reserved for clients or professional colleagues. "I was thinking about what you mentioned earlier, about your investment experiences. I have to admit, I'm pretty curious about your approach to market analysis. Maybe we could continue that conversation sometime when we have more privacy." This was a remarkable shift from someone who had spent years explaining basic financial concepts to me as if I were incapable of understanding sophisticated investment strategies. But Matthew's newfound respect was tinged with an underlying need to position himself as someone who could still provide valuable guidance, even if my success exceeded his initial expectations. "I'd be happy to discuss it," I replied, maintaining the modest tone of someone who was pleased but not surprised by his interest. Though I should warn you that my methods are probably quite different from what they teach in business school. I tend to focus on long-term fundamentals rather than short-term market movements. "That's exactly what I'd like to understand," Matthew said, and I could hear the genuine curiosity in his voice, mixed with something that sounded like professional anxiety. "How do you identify companies with strong fundamentals before their potential becomes obvious to other investors?" That kind of analytical framework could be incredibly valuable for understanding market opportunities. The irony was breathtaking. Here was Matthew asking me to explain analytical frameworks that I had been developing and refining for 4 decades, while he remained completely unaware that those same frameworks had been used to evaluate his own firm as an acquisition target. His request for investment guidance was coming from someone whose business I was planning to purchase in less than 18 hours. Over the next several hours, Matthew's behavior became increasingly complex and somewhat contradictory. He seemed genuinely impressed by my apparent financial success, but he was also clearly struggling to maintain his sense of intellectual authority in our relationship. The result was a series of conversations where he acknowledged my capabilities, while simultaneously trying to position himself as someone who could help me optimize my strategies. "The thing is," he explained during a follow-up call later that evening, "individual investors, even successful ones, often miss opportunities for tax optimization and risk management that become obvious when you understand the broader regulatory and market environment. That's where someone with legal and business training can add real value to an investment strategy." This offer to help me optimize my investment strategy came from someone whose personal financial situation was so precarious that he had been borrowing money from Claire to make student loan payments. But Matthew's confidence in his ability to improve my results was so complete that he apparently saw no contradiction between his financial struggles and his role as my potential advisor. "That's very thoughtful of you," I said, recognizing that Matthew was trying to establish a new dynamic where he could maintain some position of authority despite the revelation of my wealth. "I suppose there's always room for improvement, especially when it comes to understanding the legal implications of various investment structures." The next morning brought even more interesting developments as Matthew began treating me with the kind of careful respect he typically reserved for important clients or potential business partners. When he called to confirm our lunch plans for the following day, his tone suggested someone who was actively managing a relationship that had suddenly become important to his professional interests. "I was thinking," he said, his voice carrying the calculated enthusiasm of someone who had been developing a strategy overnight. "Maybe we could make this more of a business discussion rather than just a family lunch. I'd love to get your perspective on some of the market opportunities we're seeing in the legal services sector. Someone with your investment experience might have insights that could be really valuable for our firm's strategic planning." This request for my insights on legal services market opportunities was particularly fascinating, given that my analysis of that exact market had led to the decision to acquire his firm. Matthew was essentially asking me to provide investment advice about a transaction where I was the undisclosed buyer and he was the unwitting seller. "I'd be interested in hearing about your firm's situation," I said carefully. "Though I should mention that I don't have much experience with service businesses. Most of my investments have been in companies that produce tangible products rather than professional services." This was technically true, but deliberately misleading. While my portfolio did include substantial investments in manufacturing and technology companies, my business acquisition strategy had focused extensively on professional services firms, including 4 law practices that I had successfully purchased and improved over the past 8 years. Matthew's response revealed how desperately he needed to believe that I might represent a solution to his firm's financial problems. "That's actually perfect," he said, his voice brightening with what sounded like genuine relief. "Someone with an outside perspective might see opportunities or solutions that we've missed because we're too close to the situation. Fresh eyes can be incredibly valuable when you're dealing with complex business challenges." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Matthew providing detailed information about Robinson & Associates' financial difficulties, client base, and market positioning. He was essentially giving me a comprehensive briefing about a business that I already owned on paper, though the closing wouldn't be completed for several more hours. But perhaps most revealing was Matthew's growing excitement about the possibility that his wealthy mother-in-law might represent a potential investor who could solve his firm's problems. His tone suggested someone who was beginning to see our family relationship as a business opportunity rather than a personal connection. The beautiful thing about this situation, he explained with the kind of enthusiasm that successful salespeople develop when they sense a major opportunity, is that family investors often have different risk tolerances and return expectations than institutional investors. You might be willing to accept lower short-term returns in exchange for the satisfaction of helping build something meaningful and sustainable. This assumption that I would accept lower returns due to family loyalty demonstrated that Matthew still fundamentally misunderstood both my capabilities and my approach to business decisions. He was treating me like an unsophisticated investor who might be willing to subsidize his firm's operations rather than a serious business owner who expected professional-level performance from every investment. I suppose that depends on the specific opportunity, I said, maintaining the tone of someone who was interested but cautious. Any investment decision would need to make sense from a financial perspective, regardless of family relationships. Good intentions can't overcome poor business fundamentals. Matthew's response was immediate and enthusiastic. Absolutely. And I think you'd be really impressed by our fundamentals once you understand the full picture. The legal services market is incredibly stable, our client base is diversified across multiple practice areas, and the partners have decades of experience in this market. We're really just dealing with some temporary cash flow issues that could be resolved with the right kind of strategic investment. This description of temporary cash flow issues was a considerable understatement of Robinson & Associates' actual financial situation, which my due diligence had revealed to include systematic operational problems, declining client satisfaction, and a partnership structure that rewarded seniority rather than performance. But Matthew's optimistic characterization suggested someone who was either unaware of these deeper issues or deliberately minimizing them to attract investment. The most interesting aspect of our evolving dynamic was watching Matthew try to balance his newfound respect for my financial success with his continuing need to feel intellectually superior. He acknowledged my investment achievements while simultaneously suggesting that I needed his guidance to understand the legal services market. He expressed admiration for my wealth accumulation while implying that his professional training provided insights I couldn't access independently. This delicate balancing act created a fascinating psychological dynamic where Matthew was simultaneously elevating and diminishing my capabilities, trying to maintain his sense of authority while acknowledging evidence that contradicted his fundamental assumptions about our relative levels of sophistication. By Thursday evening, as I prepared for the acquisition closing that would occur the following morning, I had observed a complete transformation in how Matthew perceived and treated me. The condescending attitude had been replaced by careful respect. The dismissive explanations had given way to requests for my opinions, and the assumption of my financial limitations had evolved into speculation about my potential as a business partner. But Matthew still had no idea that his respectful interest in my investment capabilities was about to become irrelevant, because in less than 12 hours, he would discover that his wealthy mother-in-law hadn't just accumulated substantial assets through patient investing. She had used those assets to purchase his failing law firm and become his new boss. The game was about to reach its climax, and Matthew was still playing by rules that no longer applied. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that made Phoenix beautiful, but I barely noticed the weather as I prepared for the most consequential business meeting of my career. At 9:30 a.m., I would walk into the conference room at Robinson & Associates and reveal to Matthew, Theodore, and Benjamin that their mysterious investor was actually the elderly woman they had dismissed as financially naive just days earlier. Dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a charcoal gray business suit that projected professional authority without being ostentatious. The outfit needed to bridge the gap between my modest public persona and my actual business credentials, signaling competence and seriousness while remaining consistent with what Matthew knew about my resources. Addison Myers had arrived in Phoenix the previous evening, bringing with her the complete legal documentation for the acquisition. We met for breakfast at 7 a.m. to review the final details and discuss the presentation strategy that would reveal my identity while maintaining the professional credibility necessary to complete the transaction. "I have to ask," Addison said, as we reviewed the closing documents over coffee and croissants. "Are you certain you want to handle the revelation this way? We could still structure this as a more gradual disclosure, perhaps revealing your business background without immediately establishing the family connection." I understood her concern. The dramatic nature of the revelation created risks that a more conventional acquisition approach would avoid. Matthew's emotional reaction could interfere with the business discussion. The family dynamics could complicate the professional relationship, and the shock of discovering his mother-in-law's true identity might provoke responses that would make future collaboration difficult. But I had spent decades hiding my capabilities to avoid exactly these kinds of complications, and the strategy had ultimately enabled worse problems than it prevented. Matthew needed to understand not just that I was wealthy, but that his dismissive attitude toward me had been based on arrogant assumptions that could have serious professional consequences. "I think the directness serves everyone's interests better than continued deception," I said finally. "Matthew needs to learn that intelligence and capability don't always come in the forms he expects. Theodore and Benjamin need to understand who they're really dealing with, and I need to stop pretending to be someone I'm not." We arrived at Robinson & Associates at 9:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the scheduled meeting time. The firm's offices occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower in downtown Phoenix, with conference rooms that offered panoramic views of the desert landscape surrounding the city. The setting was professional and impressive, though I could see evidence of the financial pressures that had driven the partners to consider selling their practice. The furniture was high quality but showing signs of deferred maintenance. The technology was adequate but not current. The general atmosphere suggested a successful firm from an earlier era that had struggled to adapt to changing market conditions and competitive pressures. Theodore Thomas and Benjamin Anderson were waiting in the main conference room when we arrived, both men dressed in their best suits and wearing expressions of nervous anticipation. They had been told that their potential investor was arriving for final negotiations, but they had no idea who that investor might be or what the meeting would reveal about their firm's future. Matthew arrived precisely at 10 a.m., carrying a leather portfolio that undoubtedly contained his detailed analysis of the firm's strategic opportunities and his recommendations for attracting investment capital. He had dressed for success in an expensive navy suit and silk tie, projecting the kind of polished professionalism that he believed would impress sophisticated investors. His expression when he saw me sitting at the conference table was a masterpiece of confusion and surprise. Clearly, he had expected to meet with serious business people who could provide the capital and expertise necessary to save Robinson & Associates. Finding his mother-in-law in the conference room suggested that someone had made a scheduling error, or that I was there for completely unrelated family business. "Evelyn?" he said, his voice carrying the kind of polite bewilderment that people use when they encounter unexpected family members in professional settings. "I didn't know you were meeting with Theodore and Benjamin this morning. Is this about Claire's birthday party?" Theodore and Benjamin exchanged glances that suggested they were equally confused about why a family member had appeared at their crucial business meeting. But Addison Myers took control of the situation before anyone could voice their confusion. "Gentlemen," she said, rising from her seat with the kind of authoritative presence that experienced attorneys develop when managing complex negotiations. "Thank you for meeting with us this morning. I'm Addison Myers, representing the investor group that has been evaluating Robinson & Associates for potential acquisition. I'd like to introduce you to my client, Evelyn Davis, principal of Phoenix Strategic Ventures." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the hum of the air conditioning system and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Matthew stared at me as if I had suddenly begun speaking a foreign language, his mind clearly struggling to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about why I was there. I'm sorry, Matthew said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. Did you say that Evelyn is your client? As in, the investor who's been considering purchasing our firm? Addison nodded calmly. Ms. Davis has been evaluating Robinson & Associates for the past 6 months as part of her ongoing strategy to acquire underperforming legal practices with strong fundamental potential. Based on her analysis, she's prepared to offer complete acquisition of the firm's assets and liabilities, with partnership opportunities for existing attorneys who meet her performance standards. I watched Matthew's face as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. His mother-in-law, the woman he had lectured about basic financial concepts for years, was apparently a sophisticated investor who owned multiple businesses and had been secretly evaluating his firm as an acquisition target. But how is this possible? Matthew asked, turning to look directly at me for the first time since the meeting began. You're a retired paralegal. You don't own investment companies or buy law firms. This has to be some kind of mistake. This was the moment I had been preparing for, the point where I would need to provide a complete and honest explanation of who I really was and what I had actually accomplished during the decades when Matthew assumed I was struggling to understand basic investment concepts. Actually, I said, my voice taking on the tone of quiet authority that I used in business settings. I'm the founder and principal of Phoenix Strategic Ventures, which owns controlling interests in 17 businesses across 6 states. I'm also the managing partner of Harbor Capital Management, which oversees a diversified investment portfolio worth approximately $127 million. And yes, I've been evaluating Robinson & Associates for acquisition because my analysis suggests that this firm has strong fundamentals but poor management. Theodore and Benjamin were staring at me with expressions of amazement and growing respect, clearly beginning to understand that their potential investor was far more sophisticated and successful than they had expected. But Matthew's reaction was more complex, a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and what appeared to be genuine disbelief. "This can't be real," he said, his voice rising slightly as the emotional impact of the revelation began to overwhelm his professional composure. "You're telling me that you've been pretending to be poor while secretly running a business empire? That every time I tried to help you understand financial concepts, you already knew more about investing than I'll ever learn?" The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and I realized that Matthew was beginning to understand not just that his assumptions had been wrong, but that his behavior toward me had been based on a fundamental misreading of our relative capabilities and experience. "I wasn't pretending to be poor," I said gently. "I was simply not advertising my success. There's a difference between deception and privacy, though I understand why the distinction might not seem important from your perspective." Addison Myers opened her briefcase and withdrew a comprehensive folder containing documentation of my business activities, financial statements, and acquisition history. The materials painted a picture of systematic success and sophisticated strategy that contradicted every assumption Matthew had made about my limitations and capabilities. Ms. Davis has a track record of identifying underperforming professional services firms and implementing operational improvements that typically result in 200–300% increases in profitability within 18 months, Addison explained, her tone suggesting that she was discussing well-documented facts rather than theoretical possibilities. Her previous acquisitions include 2 estate planning practices in Colorado, a personal injury firm in New Mexico, and a corporate law practice in Nevada, all of which are now among the most profitable firms in their respective markets. Matthew sat in stunned silence as Theodore and Benjamin reviewed the documentation, their expressions shifting from confusion to amazement to genuine excitement, as they realized that their potential investor possessed exactly the kind of expertise and resources that could transform their struggling practice into a thriving business. But for Matthew, the revelation was clearly devastating. The woman he had dismissed as financially naive was not only wealthy beyond his comprehension, but she possessed business expertise that exceeded his own by decades. Every condescending explanation he had offered, every patient lecture about investment strategies, every dismissive comment about my supposed limitations had been directed at someone who could have taught him things about business and finance that weren't covered in any law school curriculum. The meeting continued for another 2 hours as we discussed the specific terms of the acquisition, the operational changes that would be implemented, and the partnership opportunities that would be available to existing attorneys. But the real business had been completed in those first shocking minutes when Matthew learned that his elderly mother-in-law was about to become his boss. The immediate aftermath of the revelation played out exactly as I had anticipated, though. The emotional intensity exceeded even my careful preparations. Matthew sat in stunned silence for nearly 20 minutes while Addison Myers and I discussed the operational restructuring that would transform Robinson & Associates from a struggling practice into a profitable regional powerhouse. Theodore Thomas and Benjamin Anderson, meanwhile, displayed the kind of professional excitement that comes from discovering that your worst business crisis has suddenly become your greatest opportunity. They asked detailed questions about my previous acquisitions, my operational philosophy, and my plans for their firm's future, clearly recognizing that they were dealing with someone whose expertise could solve problems they had been struggling with for years. "I have to ask," Theodore said during a brief break in the formal proceedings, "why did you choose our firm? I mean, there must be dozens of legal practices available for acquisition. What made Robinson & Associates attractive from an investment perspective?" This was a reasonable question that deserved an honest answer, though the complete truth would have required me to explain Matthew's role in my decision-making process. I had initially targeted their firm because of the family connection, but my analysis had confirmed that the business fundamentals justified the acquisition regardless of personal considerations. "You have strong client relationships, diversified practice areas, and a solid reputation in the legal community," I replied, focusing on the legitimate business factors that supported the investment. The financial problems are entirely management-related rather than market-related, which means they can be solved through systematic operational improvements rather than fundamental business model changes. Benjamin nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly what we've been trying to tell Matthew for months. The underlying business is sound. We just need better systems, more efficient workflows, and a partnership structure that rewards performance rather than seniority." I glanced at Matthew, who was still processing the implications of learning that his business partners had been having strategic discussions about operational improvements that aligned perfectly with my acquisition analysis. His expression suggested someone who was beginning to understand that his own assessment of the firm's problems might have been less sophisticated than he had assumed. The formal closing took another hour, with wire transfers completing the financial aspects of the transaction, while legal documents established the new ownership and management structure. Robinson & Associates officially became a subsidiary of Phoenix Strategic Ventures at 12:47 p.m., making me the sole owner of the firm where Matthew worked, and transforming our family relationship in ways that would require months to fully understand. But the most important conversation happened after Theodore and Benjamin left to begin implementing the immediate operational changes I had requested. Matthew and I found ourselves alone in the conference room, surrounded by the documents that had just made me his employer and him my subordinate in a professional context that neither of us had imagined possible just hours earlier. "I need to understand something," Matthew said, his voice carrying a mixture of hurt and genuine curiosity that suggested he was finally ready to engage with reality rather than his assumptions. "How long have you been planning this? How long? Have you known that my firm was struggling and that you could solve our problems?" This was a fair question that required careful consideration. The honest answer was that I had been monitoring Robinson & Associates for months, but my initial interest had been motivated by family concern rather than business opportunity. The decision to proceed with the acquisition had been driven by Matthew's condescending behavior rather than pure financial considerations. "I've been aware of your firm's situation for about 6 months," I said carefully. but the decision to move forward with the acquisition was influenced by our conversation. Earlier this week, when you explained my supposed financial limitations to your partners while I was sitting right there, Matthew winced, clearly remembering the moment when he had used me as an example of outdated thinking about money and investment. I was trying to make a point about generational differences in risk tolerance, he said weakly. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. But you were disrespectful, I replied, not unkindly, but with absolute clarity. And more importantly, you were wrong. Your analysis of my limitations was based on assumptions about age and appearance, rather than actual knowledge about my capabilities or experience. That kind of thinking isn't just personally hurtful, it's professionally dangerous. Matthew sat quietly for several minutes, apparently working through the implications of what he was learning about himself and his judgment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a humility that I had never heard from him before. What happens now? He asked. I mean, professionally, obviously our family relationship is going to be complicated, but what does this mean for my career? Am I going to be working for my mother-in-law? Or are you planning to fire me for being an arrogant idiot? This question went to the heart of the challenge I had created by mixing family dynamics with business decisions. Matthew's professional future would depend entirely on his ability to learn from this experience and demonstrate the kind of character growth that would make him suitable for senior responsibilities in any organization I controlled. That depends entirely on you, I said honestly. You're going to be offered a junior associate position with the opportunity to earn your way back to partnership through demonstrated performance and behavioral improvement. Your compensation will be based on your contribution to firm revenues, rather than your previous seniority level, and your advancement will depend on your ability to work collaboratively with colleagues and treat all clients and staff members with respect. Matthew nodded slowly, apparently beginning to understand that his new position would require fundamental changes in his attitude and approach to professional relationships. And our family relationship? How do we handle the fact that my mother-in-law is now my boss? This was perhaps the most complex aspect of the entire situation. The revelation of my business activities would inevitably change how Matthew and Claire saw me, but it would also force all of us to develop more honest and authentic ways of relating to each other. We handle it by being honest, I said simply. No more performances, no more assumptions, no more pretending to be people we're not. You've learned that I'm more capable than you assumed. I've learned that you're more insecure than I realized. Claire is going to learn that both of us have been keeping important secrets. We work through it by acknowledging what happened and committing to better communication going forward. The conversation continued for another hour as we discussed the practical aspects of our new professional relationship and the changes that would be necessary in our family dynamics. Matthew asked thoughtful questions about my business philosophy, my operational strategies, and my expectations for his performance as an employee rather than a family member. Perhaps most importantly, he began to understand that real success in business required the kind of intellectual humility and collaborative leadership that he had never developed during his law school education or early career. The arrogance that had made him dismissive of my supposed limitations would also make him ineffective as a senior attorney in a firm that valued client service and team performance above individual ego. By the time we left the conference room, Matthew had agreed to the terms of his new employment and committed to the personal development work that would be necessary for him to succeed in an environment where respect and competence mattered more than credentials and seniority. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight, but the foundation had been established for a fundamentally different kind of relationship based on mutual respect rather than false assumptions. The drive home gave me time to reflect on what I had accomplished and what challenges lay ahead. The acquisition of Robinson & Associates represented the successful conclusion of a carefully planned business strategy, but it also marked the beginning of a much more complex process of rebuilding family relationships that had been damaged by years of deception and mutual misunderstanding. Matthew would need to learn humility, authenticity, and the kind of collaborative leadership that actually creates value in professional environments. Claire would need to process the revelation that both her mother and her husband had been keeping significant secrets about their capabilities and circumstances. And I would need to learn how to maintain professional boundaries while rebuilding personal relationships with family members who now knew the truth about who I really was. The game had finally changed, and now all of us would need to learn how to play by rules based on honesty, respect, and authentic communication, rather than carefully maintained illusions and protective deceptions. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be real in a way that our previous relationships had never been. 6 months after the acquisition of Robinson & Associates, I sat in my redesigned office on the 15th floor of the downtown Phoenix Tower, reviewing quarterly performance reports that told a story of remarkable transformation. The firm's revenue had increased by 187% over the previous period. Client satisfaction scores had reached the highest levels in the company's history, and employee retention had improved dramatically as we implemented merit-based compensation and collaborative management practices. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The real transformation had occurred in the relationships and character development that made those financial results possible, particularly in the remarkable evolution of Matthew Robinson from an arrogant associate to a genuinely effective junior partner who had earned his position through demonstrated competence rather than family connections or inherited privilege. The change in Matthew hadn't happened overnight, and it certainly hadn't been easy for any of us to navigate. The first month after the acquisition had been particularly challenging, as he struggled to accept his new position while processing the emotional impact of learning that every assumption he had made about me had been completely wrong. There had been difficult conversations, moments of resistance, and periods when I wondered whether the family dynamics would make it impossible for him to succeed in a professional environment where I was his ultimate supervisor. The breakthrough came during a client meeting in December when Matthew demonstrated for the first time the kind of intellectual humility and collaborative leadership that distinguished genuinely effective attorneys from those who simply possessed good credentials. The client, a successful entrepreneur who was restructuring her business operations, had asked detailed questions about tax implications that Matthew couldn't answer definitively. Instead of attempting to bluff his way through the discussion or dismissing the questions as beyond the scope of the consultation, Matthew acknowledged the limits of his expertise and suggested bringing in a specialist who could provide accurate guidance. More importantly, he asked thoughtful follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine interest in understanding the client's concerns rather than simply appearing knowledgeable. That was different, I mentioned to him after the client left, noting how his approach had focused on serving the client's interests rather than protecting his own ego. 6 months ago, you would have tried to explain tax law to someone who probably understands it better than you do. Matthew nodded, his expression suggesting someone who had learned to recognize and appreciate his own growth. 6 months ago, I thought admitting ignorance was a sign of weakness rather than a sign of intelligence. I'm still learning to distinguish between confidence and competence. This distinction between confidence and competence had become central to the cultural transformation that was occurring throughout the firm. Under the previous management structure, advancement had been based primarily on seniority and the ability to project authority regardless of actual knowledge or client service capabilities. Partners had been rewarded for generating billable hours rather than solving client problems, and the firm's reputation had suffered as experienced attorneys left for organizations that offered better opportunities for professional development. The new system emphasized measurable results, collaborative problem-solving, and the kind of genuine expertise that came from systematic study and practical experience. Attorneys were evaluated based on client outcomes, peer feedback, and their contribution to the firm's overall success, rather than their ability to impress senior partners or maintain the appearance of sophisticated knowledge. Theodore Thomas and Benjamin Anderson had embraced these changes with the enthusiasm of people who had been waiting decades for permission to run their firm as a genuine business rather than a traditional hierarchy. They had implemented technology systems that improved efficiency, developed marketing strategies that attracted higher quality clients, and created training programs that helped junior attorneys develop real competence rather than just professional credibility. It's remarkable how much talent we had that was being wasted under the old system, Theodore mentioned during our monthly partners meeting, reviewing performance metrics that showed consistent improvement across all practice areas. When you reward people for actual results rather than political positioning, they start focusing on becoming genuinely good at their jobs. But perhaps the most significant transformation had occurred in my relationship with Claire, who had initially struggled to process the revelation that her mother had been living a double life for her entire adult existence. The discovery that I owned a business empire while pretending to be a modest retiree had forced her to reconsider not just her understanding of my capabilities, but her own assumptions about success, authenticity, and the choices that people made about how to present themselves to the world. I keep thinking about all the times you let Matthew explain basic financial concepts to you, she said during one of our weekly coffee meetings, her voice carrying a mixture of amusement and concern. How did you stand it? How did you listen to him lecture you about things you understood better than he did? This question went to the heart of the psychological cost that my deception had imposed on all of us. By hiding my capabilities, I had enabled Matthew's arrogance while depriving Claire of the opportunity to learn from my actual experience and expertise. The performance that I had maintained to protect our relationships had actually prevented us from developing genuine intimacy based on mutual respect and honest communication. I told myself that I was protecting both of you from the complications. That would come with knowing the truth, I admitted. But I was really protecting myself from having to deal with the changes that honesty would require. It was easier to let Matthew feel superior than to force him to confront his own limitations. Claire nodded thoughtfully. And it was easier for me to see you as the reliable mother who had everything figured out, rather than recognizing that you were a person with your own ambitions and capabilities that went far beyond taking care of your family. These conversations had led to a fundamental shift in how we related to each other, with Claire beginning to see me as a mentor and collaborator rather than just a supportive parent. She had started asking for advice about her own career development, and I had been able to share insights about business strategy, professional networking, and financial planning that I had never been able to discuss honestly before. The transformation extended beyond our immediate family to include broader lessons about the dangerous consequences of making assumptions about people based on their appearance, age, or social position. Matthew's experience had taught him that intelligence and capability could take forms that weren't immediately obvious, and that the most expensive mistakes were often made by people who were absolutely certain they understood situations they had never actually analyzed carefully. This lesson had practical applications throughout the firm, as we worked with clients who came from diverse backgrounds and whose expertise might not be immediately apparent to attorneys accustomed to making quick judgments about people's sophistication and resources. The culture of intellectual humility that we were developing created better outcomes for clients while also providing more satisfying work experiences for attorneys who were learning to approach each case with genuine curiosity rather than predetermined assumptions. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that the acquisition of Robinson & Associates had accomplished far more than I had originally intended. Yes, it had provided Matthew with a necessary lesson about the consequences of arrogant behavior and had given me the satisfaction of revealing my true capabilities. But more importantly, it had forced all of us to develop more authentic ways of relating to each other and more honest ways of thinking about success, intelligence, and the complex motivations that drive people's choices about how to present themselves to the world. The financial results spoke for themselves. Robinson & Associates had become one of the most profitable and respected law firms in Phoenix, with a growing reputation for innovative problem-solving and exceptional client service. But the real success was measured in the relationships we had built and the character development that made those business results possible. Matthew had learned humility, authenticity, and the kind of collaborative leadership that actually creates value in professional environments. Claire had discovered that her mother was a person with ambitions and capabilities that extended far beyond family care. And I had finally learned to live authentically, using my actual capabilities to create value for clients and colleagues, rather than hiding my expertise to avoid uncomfortable conversations. The elderly woman who had been dismissed as financially naive had not only proven her business acumen, but had used that revelation to teach important lessons about respect, assumptions, and the true nature of intelligence and success. Sometimes the most powerful response to condescension isn't anger or argument. It's simply the quiet demonstration of who you really are and what you're actually capable of accomplishing. The game had changed permanently, and everyone was playing by better rules. 2 years later, I stood in the same conference room where Matthew had first dismissed me as too old to understand money, but everything about the space had been transformed. The outdated furniture had been replaced with modern, pieces that reflected both professionalism and warmth. The walls displayed awards recognizing Robinson & Associates as one of Phoenix's fastest-growing law firms and certificates acknowledging our innovative approach to client service and employee development. Most importantly, the room was filled with people whose presence told the story of our remarkable journey from a failing practice to a thriving business that had become a model for other professional services firms throughout the Southwest. Matthew stood at the head of the table, presenting quarterly results to a group that included not just Theodore and Benjamin, but 3 new partners we had recruited from competing firms who were attracted by our merit-based culture and collaborative approach to legal practice. His presentation style had evolved dramatically from the arrogant lecturing I remembered. He was confident but not condescending, thorough but not patronizing, clearly knowledgeable but willing to acknowledge when questions exceeded his expertise. The family law division exceeded revenue projections by 23% this quarter, he was explaining, using charts and data to support his analysis rather than relying on unsupported assertions or theoretical frameworks. But more importantly, our client satisfaction scores in that practice area reached 97%, which reflects the systematic improvements we've made in communication protocols and case management systems. Watching him present these results, I felt genuine pride in the transformation he had achieved through hard work and character development. The man who had once used me as an example of financial ignorance had become someone who understood that real success came from serving others rather than demonstrating superiority, from solving problems rather than impressing audiences, from building relationships rather than establishing hierarchies. Claire sat beside me, taking notes as the newest member of our business development team. After completing her MBA and gaining experience at a marketing consulting firm, she had joined Robinson & Associates 6 months earlier to lead our expansion into new practice areas and geographic markets. Her combination of analytical skills and authentic relationship-building abilities had already generated several major client acquisitions and strategic partnerships. The corporate law expansion is ahead of schedule, she reported when Matthew finished his presentation. We've signed 3 new retainer clients this month, and the referral network we've been building with accounting firms and business consultants is starting to generate consistent lead flow. The most satisfying aspect of watching Claire in this professional environment was seeing how she had integrated the lessons learned from our family's experience with honesty and authentic communication. She was genuinely herself in business settings, intelligent without being arrogant, confident without being dismissive, ambitious without being manipulative. She had learned to succeed through competence and character rather than performance and positioning. Theodore and Benjamin had also evolved significantly, embracing their roles as senior advisors who focused on strategic guidance and mentorship, rather than trying to maintain control through traditional hierarchical authority. Their decades of experience had become genuinely valuable resources for younger attorneys rather than barriers to innovation and improvement. I want to thank everyone for another exceptional quarter, Theodore said as the meeting concluded. When we agreed to this acquisition 2 years ago, I hoped we could stabilize our financial situation and preserve the practice we had built. I never imagined we would become the kind of firm that other attorneys want to join and that clients actively seek out for complex legal challenges. After the meeting, Matthew approached me with the kind of respectful directness that had replaced his previous patterns of either condescension or nervous deference. Our professional relationship had evolved into something that balanced family, connection with genuine mutual respect for each other's capabilities and contributions. "I wanted to mention something," he said, his tone suggesting he had been thinking carefully about whatever he was planning to share. "I've been asked to speak at the State Bar Association conference next month about innovative management practices in small firms. I'd like to include some discussion of how this acquisition demonstrated the importance of recognizing talent and expertise in unexpected forms." This request touched on something we had all learned about the broader implications of our experience. The story of Robinson and Associates had become a case study in how assumptions about age, appearance, and credentials could blind people to genuine capability and opportunity. Legal publications had written articles about our rapid growth and cultural transformation. Business schools had used our acquisition as an example of successful turnaround strategies, and other professional services firms had adopted elements of our performance-based partnership model. "I think that would be valuable," I replied, "though I'd suggest focusing on the systematic changes we made rather than the personal drama. The real lesson isn't that people should be more careful about underestimating their mothers-in-law. It's that organizations succeed when they create cultures that value actual competence over traditional credentials." Matthew nodded, clearly understanding the distinction between the sensational aspects of our story and the practical business principles that had driven our success. "That's exactly the message I want to convey. It's not about dramatic revelations. It's about building systems that allow people to contribute their best work, regardless of how they present themselves or what assumptions others might make about their backgrounds." As I drove home that evening through the familiar streets of Phoenix, I reflected on how completely our lives had changed since that Tuesday afternoon, when Matthew had lectured his partners about my supposed financial limitations. The transformation had been profound and permanent, affecting not just our family relationships, but our understanding of success, authenticity, and the ways that people can contribute value when they're given opportunities to demonstrate their actual capabilities. The business results spoke for themselves. Robinson and Associates had become one of the most successful and respected law firms in Arizona, with plans for expansion into Colorado and New Mexico over the next 2 years. But the personal results were equally meaningful. Matthew had developed into a genuinely effective leader. Claire had discovered her own professional passion and talents, and I had finally learned to live authentically without hiding my capabilities or downplaying my accomplishments. Most importantly, we had all learned that the most dangerous assumptions are often the ones that seem most obviously true, and that the greatest opportunities often come from situations where conventional wisdom suggests that success is impossible. Sometimes the elderly woman in the corner, the one everyone assumes doesn't understand modern business, turns out to be exactly the person who can solve problems that have stumped everyone else. The moral of our story wasn't complicated. Treat people with respect, regardless of their appearance or apparent circumstances. Never assume you understand someone's capabilities based on limited information, and remember that intelligence and competence come in many forms that don't always match traditional expectations. But perhaps most importantly, we learned that authenticity and honesty, while sometimes difficult and uncomfortable in the short term, ultimately create the foundation for genuine success and meaningful relationships that can withstand any challenge. The game had indeed changed permanently, and everyone was not only playing by better rules, they were winning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.